Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat T'rumah, in which we begin reading the lengthy, detailed instructions concerning the building of the Mishkan, the physical location of the sacrificial system. The Mishkan, once completed, will be a portable sanctuary, which the Israelites will carry with them throughout their wandering in the desert. The Mishkan will serve as the physical center of their religion. It will be the location of the sacrifices. It will be the spot from which God communicates to Moses, who will pass these divine messages on to the Israelites. Eventually, once the Israelites are established in the Promised Land and King David has completed the military conquest of Israel, his son, King Solomon, will build the Beit HaMikdash, the permanent temple in Jerusalem. The Mishkan, about which we first read in this week's Torah portion, is the precursor to the temple in Jerusalem. The details of construction of the Mishkan will dominate the rest of the book of Exodus. As a matter of fact, with the exception of the golden calf incident, the rest of the book of Exodus is devoted to matters related to the Mishkan and the sacrificial system. In this week's Torah portion, we'll read details concerning materials for the Mishkan, the Ark, the menorah, not the Hanukkah menorah, that's something that will come later in our history, but the menorah, the 7-branch candelabrum that stood in the Mishkan and later in the temple in Jerusalem. The portion talks about curtains and tents and veils and altars. Future Torah portions in Exodus will deal with lamps and oil and priestly vestments and ritual sanctification of the priesthood and daily sacrifices. Why did God command all of this? The 10 Commandments, which we read just 2 weeks ago, don't mention sacrifices. There are, of course, ritual concerns in the 10 Commandments, the prohibitions against worshiping other gods and creating any idols or images of the divine, or swearing falsely by God's name, and of course, Shabbat. There are ethical concerns in the 10 Commandments as well, the prohibitions against murder and adultery and stealing. But the 10 Commandments don't say a word about tabernacles or sacrifices or priests. Even Parashat Mishpatim, the portion preceding T'rumah, the so-called covenant code that followed the giving of the 10 Commandments, also doesn't mention the sacrificial system or its trappings. Why, apparently out of the blue, did God instruct Israel to build the Mishkan? Why the sudden concern for a physical tabernacle and all of the elaborate details of construction? Why did the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One, instruct Israel to build this elaborate tabernacle and to offer sacrifices in it? What were the circumstances of what at first glance appears to be a radical shift of emphasis in the Torah? And finally, what is it about the instructions and their circumstances that can teach us anything about their significance in our own lives? In a sense, the answer is provided quite succinctly by the Torah itself. Here's Exodus 25, verse 8. Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. But in another way, this succinct explanation raises even more questions. What does it mean that God will dwell among the Israelites? Is the Mishkan really intended to be the physical resting place of God? Does that mean that God needs a physical resting place? How can an incorporeal God dwell among human beings? The question was asked by King Solomon when he completed the temple. Ki ha'umnam yeshev Elohim al haaretz? Will God really dwell on earth? Hinei hashamayim u'shmei hashamayim lo yichal kalucha. Even the heavens in their uttermost reaches cannot contain you. Ach ki habayit hazeh asher baniti. How much less this house that I have built. The same point was made centuries later by the prophet Isaiah when he spoke to the Jews on God's behalf as they were finishing the second temple. Hashamayim kis'i v'ha'aretz hadom raglai. The heaven is my throne, God said, and the earth is my footstool. Ezeh vayit asher tivnu li, ve'ezeh makom menuchati. Where could you build a house for me? What place could serve as my abode? To solve the mystery, let's first consider the circumstances in which God gave these commandments regarding the building of the Mishkan. A number of explanations are offered by our classical commentators. The first explanation that I want to share with you is that God did not originally intend to create the Mishkan and the sacrificial system. God did so only after the incident of the golden calf. Wait a minute, some of you might be thinking. The golden calf incident hasn't yet occurred. We've just completed the 25th chapter of Exodus. We won't read about the golden calf until chapter 32 in Parashat Ki Tisa, which we'll read in another 2 weeks. But our tradition does state, Ein mukdam uchar batorah. Strict chronology is not always maintained in the narratives of the Torah, and there is midrashic support for the idea that the instructions for the Mishkan were given by God after the golden calf incident. A number of midrashic sources suggest that Moses went up the mountain on the 6th of Sivan, that's Shavuot. Moses discovered the golden calf and shattered the first set of stone tablets on the 17th of Tammuz, which is observed as a fast day, primarily because of its historical association with the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. And finally, on Yom Kippur, God reconciled with the Israelites. And on the following day, having received the divine instruction to do so, they began contributing to the construction of the Mishkan. The Mishkan, in the light of these midrashim, was a symbol of God's forgiveness. And the symbolism is very appropriate here. Many of the ritual sacrifices that were offered in the Mishkan were intended to guarantee subsequent expiation of sin for the Israelites. But some of these midrashim indicate that the instructions regarding the Mishkan weren't simply given after Ma'aseh HaEgel. Rather, they were given as a result of the incident of the golden calf. Through their backsliding, according to this view, the Israelites proved that they were not yet ready to accept abstract monotheism, the worship of an incorporeal God in a world of idolatry. They simply were not yet theologically sophisticated enough to sustain their belief in an intangible God. They required tangible symbols of the divine. Therefore, God said, V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. In other words, God gave them the tangible trappings of the Mishkan and the sacrificial system so that they could sustain their faith, so that God could continue to dwell in their midst. The commandments regarding the sacrifices seen in this light were given to Israel as a concession to human frailty, a concession to their need for tangible symbols of their intangible God. This view is supported by another midrash, which doesn't mention the sin of the golden calf, but which nevertheless posits that the Mishkan was given to Israel in response to Israel's need. In this midrash, we read of a dialogue that occurred between God and Israel. Master of the universe, Israel said, the kings of the nations all have their tent, table, candlesticks, and incense burner. Such are the trappings of sovereignty. Every king is in need of such things. Shouldn't you, our King, Redeemer, and Savior, also be equipped with the trappings of sovereignty? God responded to Israel, my children, you who are flesh and blood have need of all this, but I do not need it. Israel, however, persisted. They needed a physical embodiment of God's presence in their lives, even if God didn't need it. Therefore, God responded, if so, make that which you desire, but make them as I command you. And with that, God revealed the detailed instructions for the Mishkan. Both of these explanations, of course, are in consonance with the assertion of Moses Maimonides that God gave Israel the mitzvot of the sacrificial system because the ancient Israelites were unable to relate to God without such tangible symbols. This often leads some of us to the rather smug conclusion that our ancestors were so theologically primitive and that we are so theologically advanced in comparison to them. After all, we don't need animal sacrifices to relate to God. But before we get too much of a stiff neck by looking down our noses at our ancestors, we should consider the assertions of a contemporary theologian named Paul Tillich. Tillich pointed out that since we are finite beings, the reality of the infinite is beyond our direct experience or our understanding. We are all in need of religious symbols, Tillich taught, to point to the reality of the infinite, to open up levels of reality that otherwise would be closed to us, to link us, finite beings, with the infinite. These religious symbols are no less essential in modern religion than they were in ancient religion. And so when we see the Mishkan as a concession to human frailty, as I said a few moments ago, we need not think of that in terms of our ancestors' primitivism or spiritual weakness, but simply as a concession to the fact that they, as all finite beings, needed tangible symbols to relate to God, the infinite. The tangible trappings of religion are necessary for us, just as they were necessary for our ancestors to bring God into our experience. But we should always remember that those tangible trappings of religion are a means toward an end and not an end in themselves. Our ancestors forgot that lesson, and according to the prophets, God punished Israel for her moral corruption by destroying the very temple that God had commanded her to build. This lesson is an easy one for us to forget as well, as we concern ourselves sometimes too much with the physical, tangible aspects of our religious lives, as we struggle with our own tendency to forget what they are supposed to point to. Let's return to that short and significant verse in our Torah portion. Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Notice that the verse does not say, Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocho. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in it. Rather, betocham, among them. On one hand, of course, this indicates that the Mishkan was not to be considered the physical abode of God. After all, God has no physical form and therefore needs no physical place. The Mishkan was supposed to be a place where through the rituals performed there, God's presence could be experienced by the people who participated in those rituals. But there's another level of meaning in this phrase, I think. The verse should do more than simply making a statement about God and physicality. God said, betocham, among them, rather than betocho, in it, to stress the fact that God's presence should not be experienced only in the rituals performed in the Mishkan, but betocham, among them, in the lives of the people, outside the Mishkan as well as inside, in their home lives, in their secular lives, in their business lives, in their interpersonal lives. If the Mishkan is to have any meaning, it must not contain God, either physically or experientially. It must be the catalyst that brings God bitocham, among them, in all of their lives, wherever they go, in all that they do. This is the challenge which the Israelites faced as they set out to build the Mishkan. It is no less a compelling challenge to us in our own religious institutions and religious rituals, in our own lives, in our own relationship with God. Shabbat Shalom.